business transactions are not about the numbers.
David is the CEO of Buy and Build Advisors. He's co-founder, has devoted his career to demystifying business acquisitions and scaling strategies. Years of hands-on experience in transforming business, David empowers entrepreneurs to navigate acquisitions with confidence in achieving sustainable success.
Thanks for having me on this morning. I'm excited to be on and excited to talk about my favorite subject, business acquisitions. I've been in and out of the acquisition space for about 5 years. I've worked as a advisor to small and middle market companies for about 10 or 15 years. I've been a serial entrepreneur myself, so I've been on this side of the desk as an entrepreneur and business owner for over 25 years.
Well, one of the bigger problems that a business owner has is, first, do I want to sell? Then they make the decision, well, maybe I want to sell, but every time I talk to a prospective client, one of the first things I tell them, your business is for sale. If not today, a year from today, 5 years from today. We actually talked to a business owner yesterday of a fairly large company, and she says, I don't want to sell this. I said, you need to run it like it's for sale, because if you run it like it's for sale, you're going to reduce every expense that's not necessary. You're going to try to figure out every possible way to improve the revenue and the margin, because every time you put $100,000 on the bottom line, if you're transactional, you've just made $400,000 in value. If you're tech-driven, you've just made somewhere around $800,000 in increased value. And if you're a SaaS company, you could be $1.2 million to $1.4 million. So depending on your company, that $100,000 starts to become very important, $1 at a time.
You're absolutely right. I'm usually a little more blunt in my response. What I tell business owners is every owner exits their business. Your choice is whether you exit vertically or horizontally.
All right. Well, you just given me a new tagline to work with on that. So the pieces that go from there is, how much is my company worth? Somebody's got to have that value. And then the reality, it's only worth what somebody's willing to pay for it. But you've got to have a starting point, have an idea. And then once you've got that idea, then the next situation is, where are those people that might want to buy my business? Let's talk about one of the pain points here of struggling to find that viable acquisition opportunities.
We actually work mostly on the buy side of the world. So we are the folks that are out there trying to buy that business. And ironically, we're struggling to find good businesses to buy. So clearly there's an inefficiency in the marketplace. In the lower middle market and the small business, Main Street business, as I call them, so businesses doing below 2 million or so in EBITDA or maybe 10 to 20 million in top line revenue. Those Main Street businesses usually transact through a business broker. And here's an absolutely frightening fact. Over 80% of the businesses listed for sale with a business broker never sell. It's very sadly a horribly inefficient network and process. And I think a lot of that is going back to that point of what you were just talking about, Paul, is that particularly on the Main Street level, the business owners aren't really prepared for what it takes to sell the business. They're not, to the point you were making, they're not really running it in a way that makes it sellable. They need to have team, they need to have systems and processes. The whole business can't exist just up here in the owner's head. There's got to be a way for the business to run when they're gone. One of my favorite questions I ask sellers when I sit down with them for the first time is, imagine that your best buddy just called you up and said, hey, you're not going to believe this. I just bought an 80-foot sailboat and I'm going to sail around the world for 6 months. And I want you to come with me. We're leaving tomorrow. And we're not taking any communication equipment with us. When you come back from that trip, would your business be better off, worse off, or would it not even exist?
Well, that's one of the things, whenever I'm talking to somebody, the term that's frequently used in this industry is the Switzerland effect. Can the business stand on its own? Not only does it exist when he gets back, maybe it exists, but maybe it's 75% of what it was because the business is too dependent upon that person.
It may not even be sellable, depending on how dependent it is.
He needs to have that succession plan and needs to have the pieces in place that you were just saying, getting the tools in place, the SWOT analysis of where's my strengths, where's my weaknesses, what do I need to fix? And how do I protect this company from that while I'm sailing on that boat around the world?
I've also heard it described as the bus factor. The bus factor is how many people would have to get hit by a bus before the business would start to fail.
What do we do to make sure what we're buying is worth what we think it is?
That's really the bulk of where we live at Buy and Build Advisors. Is folks have identified a business, maybe they have it under LOI, and then they bring us in and we work with them. We have separate teams that work on the legal side, looking at all the legal aspects of the business, looking for those hidden traps and pitfalls that might exist out there, potential claims against the business, have all the taxes been filed properly, all of those things, is the company set up legally, as well as preparing all those definitive agreements, and there's, even to buy a Main Street business, there's hundreds of pages of documents that have to be drafted to do that transaction, as you know. We also have then a quality of earnings team that goes in and analyzes the finances of the business. The way I explain it to folks who don't know what that means is basically we triangulate between the bank statements and the tax returns and the financial statements, and we make sure that we can draw a line between all of those and that those lines actually connect. I think the most valuable thing that we do, and it's not something that a lot of people put value in, is our operational due diligence and operational transition piece. And that's our team that comes in and really evaluates, Jim Collins, the business author, uses the term right people, right seats. And that's a lot of what we do. We look at the business from that perspective of, are the right people sitting in the right seats on the bus doing the right things? And what things are they doing? How well is that documented? And my partner who leads that up, Andrew Lamb, for anybody who remembers the 1960s version of Star Trek, Mr. Spock did this thing he called the Vulcan mind meld, where he could suck all the thoughts out of somebody's brain. And Andrew kind of has a way of doing that as well, using a series of Loom video interviews and flowcharts and graphs and all kinds of AI technology, actually, that's really been an amazing tool for him. So we have a system that we follow that between about 30 days pre-closing and 90 days post-closing, we can basically take everything in the owner's head and turn it into an owner's manual for the business.
Pre-stage to that is, where's the money going to come from? How are you going to pay for that? Now, in your particular situation, you're going to come in with funds, but you're not going to be 100% out of pocket. You want a company that has value sufficient to support financing of that transaction.
And in the Main Street business world where we mostly live, the bulk of those transactions are funded or supported by SBA loans through a bank. Just so the audience is fully aware, you talk about I'm getting an SBA loan, but unless it's like a disaster because you've had a tornado or a hurricane or COVID or something like that, those loans are not coming directly from the Small Business Administration. They're actually coming from national and regional and community banks that partner with the SBA, and the government basically guarantees that loan so that the bank is more comfortable making the loan. So that's mostly the transactions that we do. I was just actually totaling up a couple of nights ago, partially because I knew our conversation was coming up today, but we hit a milestone with BBA that we hit the 1-year anniversary of the first deal that we closed with a client this month. And so we went back and totaled up, and we've done $37.5 million worth of transactions in the last year. All of those except one were financed with SBA funding.
What is the timing of an SBA loan? I've had companies come to me and say, we want to sell, but we want to do this in 60 days.
You can do it within 60 days. It's just we're not starting today to count that 60-day window.
We have to be respectful of the fact that SBA doesn't move quite like a bank, and most banks don't move with expediency.
I would say a reasonable time frame to get a deal closed from the letter of intent stage. So you've already identified the deal. The buyer and the seller have come to broad terms about what the deal is going to look like, and they've signed usually what's called a letter of intent or a term sheet that kind of broadly outlines the transaction. From that point, and that's usually where we get involved, a reasonable time frame for conventional financing or SBA is probably 90 to 120 days. For SBA, it leaks out to more like 180 days. The due diligence work, let me back up and say this. We could do the work and close a deal if we didn't have to deal with outside influences. If you were a cash buyer or it was a 100% seller finance deal, which does happen in both cases from time to time. So you don't have any outside financing sources, and the seller is completely ready with all of the information we need with due diligence. It's a 2 to 4 week process. It's not an onerous process. The problem is the more players get involved in the game, the old saying, too many cooks spoil the broth. And that's really what happens is once you get lenders involved, once you get accountants and attorneys involved on both sides of the deal, once you get this deal team up to 5, 10, 15 people, there's just so much coordination that has to happen that it tends to bog down the process. One of the things we do in our process, we've taken a little bit of a different approach. We've actually implemented a platform that's used by Fortune 100 companies in their transactional work called Deal Room, and following up on Deal Room's approach of buyer-led due diligence. So we actually step in and lead the process because we know what's going to happen. We know what the bank is going to expect. And so we're trying to pace ahead of the bank, ahead of the SBA, get all of the information so that we can then put it all in front of them in one complete package.
We recently did a quality of earnings for an investment banking company here in Dallas, and the transaction was for a $60 million close. And we're doing the due diligence, the quality of earnings. We get in there, and the books are not on GAAP. And we're trying to work with the company to get the books on GAAP, which is their weakness in the company. They've got great product, great sales, great execution on operations, but the books are not in place. And the owner of the company did not feel that it was necessary to do all of that. Needless to say, that deal didn't close. Another one that we were involved in, C-Suite was involved in, we got into it. We did a turnaround with it. It was for sale for $6 million. 15 months later, we sold it for $29 million. But I can tell you the last 12 months of that was negotiating with potential buyers. But the real problem when we got into it was not the books. We had the books in great shape, but they came in and we were selling it on a future 12. So we had to constantly prove through the closing that what we were projecting was going to happen because we made so many changes in the company. But then they brought in one company for all the human capital, another company for all the legal, another company for the financial Q of A, who then brought in a subset company to help them with that Q of A. And then we had the representative buyer that had a potential ownership in it, or at least takeout in it, along with the buyer. So when you talk about complicated and replication of documents, that one little sale sold for $29 million, but we had over 2,400 documents produced to complete that sale. To me, that's the extreme, but that can happen.
And that's, one of the things that makes us really kind of unique in what we've put together, particularly in the Main Street world, that sub 20 million valuation world, is that we're the one-stop shop on the buy side. So we're coordinating all of those things in the background, but you've got a single point of contact, as my partner Andrew says, a single neck to choke if things go sideways. Because otherwise, all of that coordination and getting the right people to have the right information at the right time can be absolutely maddening.
You do have a platform that is singular point of contact from their standpoint. And when I say from their standpoint, that's extremely important because like the one that I just spoke of, when the buyer representative came in for his own fiduciary responsibility, he starts bringing in other companies into it. That particular due diligence cost that company over $700,000. And it was only $29 million, which is, right. It's a good sale, but it's not that big. Those costs can be 10 to 20% of that if done right. That's why people want to know who David Girault is that can come in for that one throat to choke from the standpoint of connection. Planning for that integration early is extremely important. Let's go a little deeper into the operational optimization, cultural alignment, things of that nature, getting it prepared for that last 30 days that you were talking about a minute ago, and then the 60-day rollout for the new buyer.
As Andrew likes to say, he initially started with digital equipment and then got acquired into Compaq and then got merged into Hewlett-Packard. So he has some great, and was around for the EDS transaction with them. So he's got great experience of how not to do acquisitions and integrations. But as a result, and he's led teams globally at HP, and so he's really a great people person in terms of not personal relationships, although he's very relatable, he's Irish, but he's a great people person in terms of being able to assess teams and assess the situation and create. One of the big things we do is we create a communication strategy for the transaction. Because at the end of the day, people are the most important asset of the business. If the people don't stick around, then that's going to be a serious problem for both the buyer and the seller. What Andrew does and what Andrew focuses on is, number one, we have several assessment tools we use to help understand who the buyer and seller are and what makes them tick, as well as the senior leadership of the company that's being acquired. And then we build a communication strategy around that, because when the buyer walks in on day one, no matter what words are spoken, what all of the team hears is, oh my God, everything is changing. I'm probably going to lose my job. And so we use principles of communication and of marketing and things like that to build a communication strategy to, number one, repeat a consistent message and to bring the leadership team and then the secondary kind of middle management team in and incorporate them into that communication strategy so that the messaging is consistent, and we have an FAQ platform so that people can ask questions and make sure that they get answered and get heard and feel comfortable. Our goal is that rather than them feeling panicked about their future, that the buyer is enrolling these folks in their vision of the new future of the company, and that they should actually be more comfortable about the future with the buyer than the uncertainty of the seller and his or her pending retirement and what's going to happen to the business if they just decide one day to lock the doors and walk away. So that's a key part of what we do, is really managing that communication strategy. And then that strategy goes out beyond the immediate team, and it also goes out to the key vendors and key customers of the business so that everyone is informed, and everyone is informed with a consistent message, and it's the message that's crafted around the future vision of the company that the buyer has.
Talk about the methodology of communication to deal with both of those scenarios.
In the Main Street world, most businesses are individually owned, or a small family group, or maybe a couple of partners own the business. And almost without exception, what we run across is initially no one on the team knows. Not a fan of that. I really would like at least the senior management team to have some inkling that there's a change afoot, because it's really, what concerns me is in those scenarios is when we walk in to actually visit, there has to be this massive cloak and dagger game of, you're here from the insurance company and you're here just to review our practices and check out the factory floor, and make sure everything's okay with insurance. Okay, well, that's great. But in 2 months, when I walk back in and introduce myself as the new owner, everyone is going to feel like they've been totally hoodwinked. Wait a minute, that was the insurance guy a month ago. I don't like the cloak and dagger aspect of keeping it under wraps. I do understand that it needs to be managed, though, because particularly, it's kind of circling back to that conversation we were having about SBA and deals dragging out. One of the issues you have is if it takes a while to get the deal put together, maybe the buyer has some issues with financing, maybe there's issues that come up in due diligence that require some restructuring of the deal. All of those are realities. They're not panic modes, but people, particularly in lower tiers of management and the front line, they've never transacted a business before. They've never owned a business in many cases before. And so they don't know what to expect, and they don't understand that bumps in the road are normal to the process. They're not things that we throw up our hands and scream and run from the room about. And so you have to be careful about balancing that knowledge group of the transaction to make sure that you don't get it down to a level that people start losing faith in the business and in the transaction because it maybe drags out a bit. We talk with sellers about having a conversation with them at some point 30 to 60 days before our anticipated closing date that we want to let the cat out of the bag. What I usually say is the reality of the situation is, and we've had sellers that are like, nope, we don't want to tell them until the day we close. The week before closing, a whole bunch of really, really strange things go on. We do things like count inventory 2 different times, and we've never counted inventory before in the history of the company, and now we're doing it twice in 1 week. And we're gathering up copies of all of these documents that have been stuffed in a box in the attic for 10 years. Why is all this happening? And so if it's a complete secrecy level, the cat's going to get out of the bag.
Now, maybe you've already talked about we're going to buy and sell, but when we're going through that, if the team after the sale don't have a level of confidence where they're going to fit post-sale, what is the benefit to them? Why do they want to prove themselves again to a new owner, other than the fact they get to keep a job? But the management team certainly wants to know a future. So what do you do when you're going into a company to present the future as you see it? I've been in so many PE firm acquisitions where they come in and buy and start cutting the cost to start paying for the buy. They had a knee-jerk reaction where they cut 30% of the force. So how do you avoid that kind of private equity firm acquisition?
Of keeping everybody comfortable is usually important to the seller. Keeping everybody on board, these people have been with me for years and years. I want to make sure they're taken care of. I think that's a lot more common in Main Street than it is as you get into the middle market. Private equity does a couple of things well and does a couple of things really, really badly. One of the things they do badly is take smaller businesses that don't have the systems and processes and step in and put them in place. That's really where we play in the Main Street world, is taking those Main Street businesses, working with buyers who have the skill set to go in and really systematize and processize the businesses and take them up to a level where they might be acquirable by PE, but they're acquirable by PE in a way that they are stable and have a foundation for growth so that PE can do what they're good at, which is then pouring capital into the business to fuel growth. What they're not good at is doing things that aren't positioned to pour capital on and fuel growth. And so I think part of that is know your business, know what the capabilities are, and take off the rose-colored glasses and be able to truly assess, is this business sellable to a PE group that wants to scale it, or are they going to look at it differently? And then number two is look at the PE group if you're talking to private equity about selling your business. Look at their track record and what they do with businesses, because they're all going to tell you that they're not going to lay everybody off. They're all going to tell you they want a business that stands on its own 2 feet and that they can use as a platform to scale. But look at their track record. The track record speaks more strongly than the words. So if they have a track record that is consistent with that, then it's fairly reliable that they will do that with your business, assuming the tools and the systems and the platform are in place. But if they have a track record of dismantling things or stripping things down, then it's pretty likely that that's their MO and that's what they're going to do. So I think having advisors on the sell side that know the marketplace and know who the players are and that are properly presenting your business in front of buyers that meet your objectives. And some of that, frankly, is on the seller's part, knowing what the outcomes are that you want. What are the things that are important to you as the seller besides the money? One of the first questions we always ask a seller, other than the money, assume we can come to terms on the money. If the business is there and the numbers support it, assume we can come to terms on the money. Other than the money, what's important to you? If your buyer's not asking that question, that could be a red flag that they don't really care what's important to you.
And if you're there strictly for the money, the buyer needs to be buyer beware.
Yep.
Because he's going to have that knowledge that they don't care, so they're going to do anything they can, and it could affect the transition. Talk to me about how you foster that leadership development through the closing, through the process transitioning from founder-led to team-led.
So a lot of that is, number one, we use several assessment tools like the DISC profile, the YOS assessment. And we really, number one, get to know the team and get to know the people and understand what makes them tick. Because that's really key. Good communication is the result you get. And so if you're not getting the result you want, it's probably your fault for not communicating well. So we really are extremely intentional about the communication process and about bringing the buyer group in and having one-on-one interactions and listening. To the extent that there's a core team there that is capable of stepping up and leading.
What does this company, what does David Girault, what does buy and build advisors want to be remembered for?
Really, I think the main theme for us is buying a business, although it involves a transaction, it's not a transactional exercise. It's something that needs to be done with planning and with intention, and that planning and intention can lead to creating long-term success. There's strategery involved in it, and there's planning involved in it, and there's careful consideration. But with the right strategies and the right focus, every challenge turns into an opportunity for growth and for success. And so that's how we approach it.
What's some of the most challenging situations, or what kind of pushback do you get when you ask some of these businesses about exiting?
We have what I affectionately refer to as the mother of all due diligence checklists. And I've had several brokers and business owners who go, wow, this is such an exhaustive process for such a small deal. And our average transaction value is about $4.5 million. We're not doing the $20, $30, $50 million deals. But you fought tooth and nail to get that value to be $2 million, $3 million, $4 million for this transaction. So clearly that amount of money is important to you. well, yeah, that's everything. This is my whole life savings. I'm like, why do you think it's not important to the buyer that they're signing up to pay you that amount of money and they want some assurance that they're actually going to be successful? That's really what all this is about. I remember back in my and your childhood, because you and I are about the same age, we're a little younger than that other guy that was on the call, but you and I remember the days when Ronald Reagan was negotiating with Gorbachev about nuclear arms, and Reagan's line he always used was trust but verify. That's what the whole due diligence process boils down to, is we have an obligation on behalf of our buyer clients to verify and validate that everything that's been said is indeed true and that things are going to be as they are promised. That's really, I think, the toughest piece of this process is sellers going into it unprepared by their advisors to do the business equivalent of a colonoscopy, but the fact that these questions are being asked. And that's a lot of times what happens, I think, in the small business world is, well, my business is successful. Why are you asking me questions about it? I need empirical evidence that shows me that what you say is true. And in most cases, it's there. You know, they may not have the most perfect set of books. They may not have GAAP financials. Thankfully, the SBA really works on tax returns more than GAAP financials anyway. But in the Main Street world, we're more focused on however they're keeping the books. Are they doing it consistently so that we can see trends year over year? We want to just validate those trends. We want to make sure that our client who's signing up, in many cases with an SBA loan, not here in Texas because we're special with the homestead laws, but in most places around the country, the buyer is literally putting their home on the line. They're having to pledge their house as collateral to the bank to make this loan. If they're taking that level of risk to buy this business, I have an obligation as their advisor to assure that that's not really a risk. And usually when you put it that way, you know, when you say, oh, wow, they're putting their house on the line. Yeah, they are. That's how committed they are to buy your business. So can I ask you a few more questions? Oh, yeah. Okay.
What is the advice, or you as a mentor, that you would tell someone trying to get into planning a strategy what they should do?
From the exit side, I think the most important thing to understand is, particularly if you're working in the Main Street or in the lower middle market, mergers and acquisitions, exits, business transactions are not about the numbers. At the Main Street and lower middle market level, it's a human game. The businesses are owned primarily by individuals, by families. They have put their entire life on the line many times for, 10, 20, 30 years building this business. And it's a human transaction. We're excited. I think one of the things that, if I can kind of share a parting comment, there's a massive wealth transfer that's on the precipice of happening in the Western world in general, but particularly in the United States. The bulk of businesses, I think over half of all small businesses and Main Street businesses are owned by baby boomers. The vast majority of those folks do not have a family member or a member of their leadership team that they feel is equipped to acquire the business. So they're looking for ways to exit. So for younger folks that are Gen Xers and millennials and even Gen Zs, there's a massive opportunity out there. If you have an interest in acquiring a business and being your own boss, there's a massive opportunity to do that not by starting a business. If you take the SBA stats, 95% of all businesses do not make it to year 10. If you go into franchising, the numbers get more like 50% are successful, 70% are successful. If you look at the SBA stats on acquisitions of small businesses, they have better than a 90% success rate, because you're buying an existing business with existing cash flow and there's a level of certainty you get. If you have an idea or an innovation that you want to apply in an industry, go buy a business in that industry and let that business cash flow your innovation. So there's massive opportunities out there for acquisitions. Likewise, if you have a small business, organic growth is great. Marketing, just getting more people in the door, doing more transactions is great. But you can compound that growth through acquisition. You can acquire vertically up and down. So you can acquire your customers if you're a B2B business. You can acquire your suppliers if you're a B2B or B2C business. So you can go vertically. You can also go horizontally. If you're a plumbing business, you can acquire an electrical contractor, acquire an HVAC contractor. If you're a roofing company, you can acquire a hardscapes and fencing company or a pool maintenance company. You can look horizontally at other things that your existing customer base would like to buy, and it's a great way to grow and scale a business. There's tons of opportunities out there, as I said, for acquisitions because of this wealth transfer that's got to take place over the next 10, 15, 20 years in America. Thanks so much for having me, Jason, and thanks to Paul. Thanks, Isabella, for all of your work on it, and we'll see you all again soon.